Hey everybody, welcome back to Out of My Head. I'm your host, KMO, and last week, or maybe it was the week before, time is fuzzy, I read a book. Actually, I listened to the audiobook of a book called The Absent Superpower, The Shale Revolution and a World Without America, or something like that. And I did a few videos on it because it was fresh in my head, and then I moved on. But a regular C-Realm podcast listener and watcher of these videos and provider of good feedback sent me the following question. Kevin writes, "Sounds like a fascinating book and author. The idea that China might break into regional powers is intellectually provocative, and I've never heard anyone else suggest it. You sound like you aren't going to do more videos on the Zeihan book, but I'm curious what evidence he might have in support of this prediction or speculation. I'm sympathetic to accepting the idea because I think technology and society are heading in the direction of balkanization and localization. The center cannot hold. I've often argued that it would be a good thing if the USA, or even just California, broke into smaller powers. But when I suggest this to virtually any other American, they almost invariably react with outrage and knee-jerk refusal to examine the very concept. I can't help but think that billions of Chinese would react the same way." All right, hey Kevin, good question, and I'm happy to return to the Peter Zeihan book. Much of what I'm going to be talking about comes from chapter 8 of the book. So the premise of the book is that the United States has been providing stability, particularly on the high seas through the use of its naval power, since the end of World War II, and that many countries have prospered because of this arrangement, but the United States doesn't really import or export that much relative to what it produces. So the United States has actually, it has benefited among the least of all the countries participating in global trade from this system, which is dependent upon the US maintaining stability and security on the high seas. And Peter Zeihan's thesis is that the US is pulling back from this commitment, and that when the US is no longer playing that role, that there is going to be a variety of disorders, including Russia looking to expand to fill the borders of the old Soviet Union, at least on the European side, and also a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and also in Northeast Asia, a competition between what he calls the NEA4. And if you Google NEA4, you're going to get something about the National Endowment for the Arts. It's nothing to do with that. He's talking about the 4 regional powers there, which are going to have to compete for control of the sea lanes in order to safely get ships and their navy, escorting their ships, to the Persian Gulf, where they will have to, as Peter Zeihan says, choose a side in a knife fight, buy their oil, and escort it safely back to their home country. So here we have Japan, South Korea, China, and Taiwan. These are the NEA4. They are all dependent on oil from the Middle East. So they're going to have to send ships down through this maze down here, this sequence of archipelago nations, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. They're going to have to somehow navigate this passage, get over here, interact with the participants in the Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict, buy oil from somebody, and then safely get it back to their home ports. His contention is not so much that China is going to break up into regional powers. In fact, I'm not even sure he says that in the book. Since I listened to the audiobook, I have listened to a lot of other experts, on geopolitics talk about this, and it might be George Friedman who says that China is going to break up into regional powers. But Peter Zeihan's contention is that China is going to lose this contest between the 4 East Asian powers. Now, here's Japan. Japan is really well positioned in order to win this contest for a variety of reasons. First of all, because Japan has a kick-ass navy. They have been doing naval power for a century. They're really good at it. They have a lot of hardware, and they have the expertise to use that hardware. Also, for anybody to assault Japan from the east, and a lot of their ports and a lot of their power facilities and such are on their east coast, you have to have a very powerful deep water navy to come and assault them from this angle. Really, none of the other East Asian powers have a navy like that. About the only navy that could really assault Japan from the east is America, and we have no reason to do so. What's more, Japan, while it is a single nation and it is a cohesive nation in terms of the identity of the people, in terms of the infrastructure, Japan is like a bunch of city-states. And Japan is an old country. Old people use less electricity and less energy in general than middle-aged and young people. So Japan has actually mothballed a lot of their power generation facilities, and they have a variety of power generation facilities and no like pipeline infrastructure or long distance electrical transmission infrastructure to share power between cities. So each city is one, it's very isolated because of the mountainous geography of Japan. Japan is basically invasion proof because of this mountainous geography. But because the cities don't have a unified power infrastructure that they all draw upon, each one is largely self-sufficient. It's got a variety of alternative power sources. So, if Japan loses imports of liquefied natural gas, they can switch over to coal. And if they lose access to coal, which is unlikely, they can switch over to oil. They just have a variety of options. China doesn't have that. So also up here, this is Sakhalin Island. This is owned by Russia. If you look at this map over here, this is all Russia. China is more inland. So the Russians, they produce a lot of petroleum up here, about 1/5 of Japan's total needs. So Japan could certainly buy petroleum from the Russians, or Sakhalin Island in the past has been part of Japan, and there are elements within the Japanese military and the Japanese political establishment who would be happy to have it back. So that's also a possibility. Once the shooting starts, once everything is up for grabs on the ocean, that's when things get dicey. This is what Peter Zeihan is talking about when he's talking about the tanker war. So here's China. Most of China's oil, we'll go back to Japan for a second. Japan is dependent on imports for 100% of its energy needs. It has no domestic supply whatsoever. No possibility for hydroelectric generation, no deposits of petroleum, no coal to speak of, no uranium. Everything it needs, it has to import. That is not the case for China. China has oil production up here in the north, in a city called Chiqing, I think it's called, which is so small and insignificant, it doesn't show up on most maps, at the national scale. But that's where their oil comes from. And their oil fields up there have peaked. They have oil processing facilities up there, which there's a pipeline that comes in from Russia to bring crude oil into this city so that it can be processed. And then most of this resource supplies Beijing. Beijing is the political capital, it is the military capital, but it's not really a commercial capital. It's not a commercial powerhouse. The commercial powerhouse cities in China are Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. Those last three are all basically, they have grown into one another. They're all down here in the south, very far from Beijing. The oil energy from up north mostly supplies Beijing. Some of it gets down to Shanghai. None of it gets down here. And in fact, this whole region is very mountainous, and transportation over land through this part of southern China is very difficult. You cannot transport food in bulk from the northern cities down to the southern cities, nor can you transport energy resources in bulk down to these southern cities. These southern cities, which are the economic powerhouse of China, are wholly dependent on imports of food and energy from the sea. So again, Japan has a kick-ass navy. China has a sorry excuse for a navy. So back to the big map. We have Japan here, South Korea here, Taiwan, and China. Japan and Taiwan, once the shooting starts, are likely to team up. Korea, if it was smart, would get in on that, but the Koreans hate the Japanese because of World War II. So South Korea might actually be tempted to throw their lot in with China, which would be a big mistake, but given the cultural animosities at play, it might be inevitable. China would need to get from its port cities, which are down here, through this mess over to the Middle East. China's navy, when you have to sail your navy and your tankers close to another country, you are within striking distance of airplanes and missiles which are land-based. How does China get through this, without being attacked? They either have to buy off a country that they're going to have to go near, or they're going to have to occupy it. And there are multiple stages to this boxed-in aspect of the geography down there. So China has got a real challenge getting their tanker ships and escorts through this region. Japan, with its powerful navy, one, could get through there just with military brute force, but they can also go across the Pacific and get petroleum resources either from North America or South America. This is a population map of China. So the red and the orange are dense population. The yellow and the sort of manila color are lighter population. You can draw a diagonal line across China. 94% of the population is on this side of the line. Only 6%, including all of Tibet, is on the other side of the line. Now, China has got some oil drilling going on over here, and they also have pipelines coming in from the various stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan. But really, this is a tiny fraction of their oil. Almost all of China's oil imports come from Saudi Arabia. They are wholly dependent on tankers from Saudi Arabia reaching Chinese port cities. And I don't have it up on screen, but if you go to Wikipedia and type in Chinese ethnic minorities, you are going to get a long list. You'll have to scroll down to see the whole list. More than 9 of those ethnic minorities have more than 1 million people each. They have huge internal populations which are not ethnically Han Chinese and are not particularly thrilled about being called Chinese, because they don't consider them Chinese and the Han Chinese don't treat them like Chinese. So, what is China struggling against? They are dependent on energy imports. They don't have very good overland transportation. They're basically, in terms of how their population is distributed, a coastal nation with their southern, economically dynamic cities dependent on oversea transport of food and fuel. This is all mountainous region. These southern cities couldn't even support their local populations if food access was cut off overseas. So Taiwan, Japan, other powers are going to try to basically carve off these southern cities, either get them to rebel against the central authority way up here in the north in Beijing, or basically starve them out or take them by force. But really, these folks down here, they would largely be better off if they were associated with the global economy, in league with Japan, in league with Taiwan, and no longer under the thumb of Beijing. So they have a strong motivation basically to carve off, to secede from China. At least, that's Peter Zeihan's contention. So the second part of your question, Kevin, is actually the more interesting part for me. You say, the center cannot hold. I've often argued that it would be a good thing if the USA or even just California broke into smaller powers, but when I suggest this to virtually any other American, they almost invariably react with outrage and knee-jerk refusal to examine the very concept. I'm not mad at the idea, and I'm happy to examine it. I don't think it's very realistic. The United States primarily is a naval power, and if we don't have access to the west coast of this continent, then the naval power of the United States is fragmented and much diminished. So I do not see the Pentagon or Washington, D.C. letting the entire west coast and all the naval assets stationed there, all the nuclear weapons stationed there, basically go their own way. I just don't see it happening. And part of Peter Zeihan's contention in the book, The Absent Superpower, is that once the United States withdraws, stops being the guarantor of safety on the high seas, the United States is sitting pretty energy-wise because we have the most highly developed hydrofracking infrastructure. Most of the world's petroleum geologists live and work in the United States. The vast majority of those with expertise in hydrofracking and shale exploration and shale production are in the United States. Basically, natural gas is a waste product in the whole extraction process of shale oil in the southwest of the United States. We have basically free methane to last forever and the most advanced infrastructure for collecting that methane, because methane and natural gas is much harder to store and transport and utilize than petroleum is. And very few other countries have anything close to the built-in infrastructure that the United States has for that. So the US is actually going to be pretty strong compared to some of these other regional powers which are going to be caught up in these conflicts over access to natural resources, particularly petroleum. All right, I've probably gone on too long. Thanks for watching. I will talk to you again tomorrow.